Sarah Martinez walked into the bustling coffee shop near the university campus. Her worn leather jacket zipped up to her neck despite the warm afternoon. The familiar sounds of steam hissing from the espresso machine and students chattering about their weekend plans filled the air. She had been coming to this place for 3 weeks now, ever since starting her psychology classes as a veteran returning to civilian life. At 28, Sarah felt ancient compared to her classmates. While they worried about term papers and dating drama, she carried memories that most people couldn't imagine. The transition from military life to college had been harder than any mission she had ever completed overseas. Every day felt like walking through a minefield of triggers and misunderstandings. She ordered her usual black coffee and found an empty table in the corner, away from the main crowd. Sarah pulled out her notebook and tried to focus on her assignment about trauma psychology. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was studying the very thing she lived with every day. Her professor had assigned the class to write about different types of trauma, and Sarah knew she could write volumes about combat stress, but she kept her personal experiences locked away. A group of students at the next table were having an animated discussion about a war movie they had seen the previous night. Sarah tried to ignore them, but their voices carried over the ambient noise of the coffee shop. "That explosion scene was so fake," laughed Jake, a freshman who always wore expensive designer clothes. "Like military people are supposed to be tough, right?" The guy in the movie was crying over a little bomb blast. So unrealistic, his friend Emma nodded in agreement. "Seriously, these Hollywood movies make soldiers seem so weak. My dad says real warriors don't break down like that. They're trained to handle anything." Sarah's hand tightened around her coffee cup. She had heard similar comments before, but today they stung more than usual. Maybe it was because she had barely slept the night before. Jolted awake by the sound of a car backfiring that her brain had interpreted as gunfire. "Plus, women in combat roles is just for show anyway," Jake continued, his voice getting louder. "I read somewhere that they can't handle the real pressure. They probably just stay in the safe zones and pretend to be heroes when they come back." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about her 3 tours in Afghanistan, the IED explosions that had left her with permanent hearing damage in her left ear, and the night her convoy had been ambushed outside Kandahar. She remembered dragging her wounded teammate to safety while bullets flew overhead, her hands covered in his blood as she applied pressure to his wounds until the medics arrived. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sudden movement caught the attention of the group at the next table. Jake looked over at her with mild curiosity, not recognizing the fire in her eyes. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about soldiers in combat." Jake grinned, clearly pleased to have an audience for his opinions. "Oh yeah, what do you think? I mean, you probably agree that these movies are way over the top with all the emotional stuff, right?" Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I think you might be surprised by what real combat is actually like. It's not like the movies at all." Emma leaned forward, interested. "Have you studied military history or something? Are you a poli-sci major?" "Something like that," Sarah replied quietly. She could feel her heart rate increasing. The familiar sensation she got when her body prepared for fight or flight. The rational part of her mind told her to walk away, to avoid the confrontation. But another part of her, the part that had been silent for too long, urged her to speak. "The thing about combat," Sarah continued, "is that it changes you in ways that are impossible to explain to people who haven't been there. The sounds, the smells, the split-second decisions that determine whether you and your teammates make it home alive. It's not about being tough or weak. It's about being human in an inhuman situation." Jake rolled his eyes. "Come on, that sounds like something from a self-help book. Real soldiers are different. They're trained to compartmentalize and move on. My uncle was in the military and he never talks about any emotional stuff. He just got on with his life." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got when she heard helicopters flying overhead or when someone slammed a door too loudly. Maybe your uncle deals with things differently than others. Maybe he talks to someone you don't know about. Or maybe he keeps it all inside, which isn't always the healthiest choice. "Look, no offense," Jake said with a condescending smile, "but unless you've actually been in combat, you can't really understand what it's like. You can read all the books and watch all the documentaries you want, but it's not the same as living it." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt the weight of her hidden truth pressing against her chest like a physical force. She thought about the Purple Heart medal sitting in a box in her apartment, the commendation letters she had never shown anyone, and the scars hidden beneath her long sleeves and high neckline. For a moment, she considered telling them everything. She imagined their faces changing from smugness to shock as she described the realities of war, but something held her back. Maybe it was the fear of their disbelief, or maybe it was the protective instinct that had kept her story private for so long. "You're right," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Unless someone has been there, they can't fully understand." She gathered her books and walked toward the exit, leaving her half-finished coffee on the table. Behind her, she could hear Jake and his friends resuming their conversation, their laughter echoing in her ears as she pushed through the door into the afternoon sunlight. Outside, Sarah leaned against the brick wall of the building and closed her eyes. The familiar sounds of traffic and students walking by seemed amplified, each noise a potential threat that her hyper-vigilant mind cataloged and assessed. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, feeling more invisible and misunderstood than ever before. The following Tuesday, Sarah found herself back in the same coffee shop, though she couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was stubborn determination, or maybe just the fact that they made the strongest coffee on campus. She had spent the weekend replaying the conversation with Jake and his friends, feeling frustrated with herself for not speaking up more forcefully. This time, she chose a different table, one with a clear view of the entrance and exit. Old habits from her military training died hard. Her therapist at the VA hospital had explained that hypervigilance was a common symptom of PTSD, but knowing the clinical term didn't make the constant state of alertness any less exhausting. Sarah opened her laptop and tried to focus on her research paper about the psychological impact of warfare on veterans. The assignment felt like cruel irony, forcing her to academically analyze her own lived experience. She had been working on it for hours when she heard familiar voices approaching. Jake and his group had returned, settling into their usual spot near the window. Sarah kept her head down, hoping they wouldn't notice her, but their conversation once again drifted toward military topics. "I saw this documentary last night about female soldiers," Emma said, stirring sugar into her latte. "It was trying to make them seem like heroes, but honestly, most of them were probably just mechanics or office workers. The dangerous stuff is still mostly handled by men." Sarah's fingers froze over her keyboard. She remembered her friend Maria, a combat medic who had saved countless lives under fire before losing her own leg to an IED. She thought about Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Hayes, who had led their unit through some of the most dangerous operations in Afghanistan with courage and precision that put most men to shame. "Exactly," Jake agreed. "I mean, I'm not saying women can't serve, but let's be realistic about their actual contributions. The real combat heroes are the guys who kick down doors and face the enemy head-on. That takes a different kind of strength." Another student, Marcus, joined the conversation. "My brother's friend was deployed to Iraq, and he said the women mostly stayed on base. They're just there to meet diversity requirements, not because they're actually needed for the fighting." Sarah closed her laptop with more force than necessary, the sharp sound echoing across the coffee shop. Several people looked in her direction, including Jake's group. She felt heat rising in her cheeks, a mixture of anger and something else she couldn't quite identify. "You guys really don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the space between their tables. Jake turned in his chair to face her fully. "Oh, hey, it's you again. Still defending Hollywood's version of the military?" Sarah stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm defending the truth. Women in combat roles aren't there for diversity quotas. They're there because they earned their place through the same training, the same standards, and the same sacrifices as everyone else." Emma raised an eyebrow. "That sounds nice in theory, but have you actually met any female combat veterans? I mean, really talked to them about what they experienced?" The question hit Sarah like a slap. She had talked to plenty of female combat veterans because she was one of them. She had shared stories and struggles with women who had faced down enemy fire, who had watched friends die, who had killed to protect their teammates. But she had never shared her own story with anyone outside those circles. "As a matter of fact, I have," Sarah replied carefully, "and their experiences are just as valid and just as difficult as any male veterans." Marcus laughed. "Come on, be honest. How many women do you know who were actually in firefights, who had to kill enemy combatants? The military might say they're in combat roles, but the reality is different. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, like a dam finally giving way under too much pressure. You want to know about firefights? About killing enemy combatants? About what it's really like? Her voice had risen, and now half the coffee shop was listening. Jake looked uncomfortable for the first time, perhaps sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere he hadn't anticipated. Look, we're just having a discussion, Jake said, his tone slightly defensive. You don't need to get so emotional about it. The word emotional triggered something deep in Sarah's memory. She remembered her commanding officer using the same dismissive tone when she had first reported symptoms of PTSD. She thought about all the times she had been told to toughen up, to compartmentalize, to not let her feelings interfere with her duties. Emotional? Sarah repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. You think discussing the reality of combat makes someone emotional? She walked over to their table, her movements deliberate and controlled. Up close, Jake looked younger than she had initially thought, maybe 19 at most. His expensive clothes and confident demeanor couldn't hide the fact that he was still essentially a child playing at understanding the adult world. Let me tell you about emotional, Sarah continued. Emotional is holding your best friend while he bleeds out from shrapnel wounds, knowing that the nearest medical help is 30 minutes away. Emotional is making split-second decisions about whether to return fire when civilians might be caught in the crossfire. Emotional is coming home and trying to explain to people like you why you wake up screaming 3 years later. The coffee shop had gone quiet. Even the baristas had stopped what they were doing to listen. Jake's face had gone pale, and Emma was staring at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Are you saying you were? Marcus started to ask, but his voice trailed off. Sarah looked around the room at all the faces staring at her. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since her first therapy session at the VA. But she also felt something else, a strange sense of relief, as if a weight she had been carrying for years was finally beginning to lift. I'm saying that you should be careful about making assumptions, Sarah said quietly. You never know who might be listening. You never know what someone has been through or what they've sacrificed. She turned to walk back to her table, but Jake's voice stopped her. Wait, he said, and for the first time, his tone held no arrogance or condescension. Were you actually deployed? Like in combat? Sarah looked back at him, seeing genuine curiosity replacing his earlier smugness. She considered her answer carefully, knowing that whatever she said next would change everything. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of every eye in the coffee shop on her. Jake's question hung in the air, and she could see genuine curiosity replacing his earlier arrogance. For 3 years, she had kept her military service private, sharing details only with her therapist and a few close friends from her unit. Now faced with the opportunity to finally speak her truth, she felt both terrified and strangely liberated. Yes, she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Army Ranger. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet space. Jake's mouth fell open slightly and Emma's eyes widened in shock. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Around the coffee shop, other students had stopped their own conversations to listen. You're a ranger? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Like actually? Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar mix of pride and pain that always accompanied discussions of her service. 75th Ranger Regiment. I served from 2018 to 2022. Emma leaned forward, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by something that looked like awe. But you're so... you don't look like... Like what? Sarah asked, though she knew exactly what Emma meant. She didn't fit the stereotypical image of a combat soldier. At 5 feet 6 inches, with shoulder-length brown hair and a quiet demeanor, she looked more like a graduate student than someone who had led missions behind enemy lines. I'm sorry, Emma said quickly. I didn't mean to assume. It's just that I never would have guessed. Sarah sat down at their table, uninvited but no longer caring about social protocols. Most people wouldn't. That's kind of the point I was trying to make. Marcus cleared his throat nervously. What was it like? If you don't mind me asking. The question opened a floodgate of memories that Sarah usually kept carefully contained. She thought about the heat of the Afghan desert, the weight of her gear during long patrols, and the constant awareness that danger could come from any direction at any moment. It was everything and nothing like what you see in movies. She began. The fear is real, but it's not the dramatic Hollywood kind of fear. It's more like a constant background hum in your brain, keeping you alert even when you're trying to sleep or eat or just have a normal conversation with your teammates. Jake had pulled out his phone, but then seemed to think better of it and put it away. Were you ever actually in combat? Like shooting at people? Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to her left shoulder, where a scar from shrapnel was hidden beneath her sweater. Multiple times. We conducted direct action raids, reconnaissance missions, and provided security for convoy operations. The enemy doesn't care if you're male or female when they're shooting at you. She paused, remembering the first time she had been forced to kill someone. It was during her second deployment when their patrol had been ambushed while escorting a supply convoy through a particularly dangerous valley. The Taliban fighter had been young, maybe 17, and for a split second before she pulled the trigger, she had seen her own brother's face superimposed over his. The hardest part, Sarah continued, isn't the actual fighting. It's everything else. It's watching your friends get hurt and not being able to do anything about it. It's making decisions in seconds that you'll think about for the rest of your life. And it's coming home and trying to explain to people why you can't just get over it and move on. Emma's eyes had filled with tears. I'm so sorry. We had no idea. The things we said, you couldn't have known, Sarah replied, though the apology didn't entirely erase the sting of their earlier comments. But that's exactly why you shouldn't make assumptions. There are veterans everywhere, men and women, carrying stories they can't or won't share. Every time you dismiss their experiences or question their service, you're adding to their burden. The barista approached their table hesitantly. Excuse me, she said softly. I couldn't help but overhear. My dad is a veteran too, Vietnam. He never talks about it, but sometimes I hear him having nightmares. I just wanted to say thank you for your service. Sarah looked up at the young woman, probably not much older than her own 22-year-old sister. Thank you. And tell your dad that his service mattered even if he doesn't talk about it. Sometimes the ones who stay quiet are carrying the heaviest loads. As the barista walked away, Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I feel like such an idiot. All that stuff I said about women in combat, about soldiers being weak if they show emotion. You're not an idiot, Sarah said, though her tone remained serious. You're just uninformed. There's a difference, and one can be fixed. Marcus looked genuinely curious now. What made you decide to serve? I mean, it's obviously dangerous, and you must have known that going in. Sarah smiled for the first time since the conversation had started. My grandfather served in Korea, and my uncle was in the Gulf War. I grew up hearing their stories, the good and the bad. I wanted to serve my country, but I also wanted to prove that women could do the job just as well as men. And did you? Emma asked. Prove it, I mean. Every single day, Sarah replied with quiet confidence. I graduated Ranger School on my first attempt, which about 60% of male candidates can't say. I led successful missions, brought my people home safe, and earned the respect of everyone I served with. But I also came home with PTSD, chronic pain from injuries, and a whole lot of memories that I'm still learning how to live with. Jake leaned back in his chair, looking overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry for being so ignorant. Don't apologize, Sarah said. Learn from it. The next time you hear someone talking about veterans or military service, remember this conversation. Remember that the person sitting next to you might have stories that would change your entire perspective on what courage and sacrifice actually look like. The coffee shop around them had gradually returned to its normal buzz of conversation, but their table remained quiet as each person processed what they had learned. Sarah looked at her watch and realized she had been talking for over an hour. Her psychology class would be starting soon, but for once, she didn't feel anxious about being late. Can I ask you something else? Emma said tentatively. Do you regret it? Serving, I mean. Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she asked herself often, especially during the darkest moments when the nightmares were particularly bad, or when the physical pain from her injuries made it hard to get out of bed. No, she said finally. I don't regret serving. I regret some of the things that happened while I was there, and I regret how hard it's been to readjust to civilian life. But I'm proud of what I did, and I'm proud of the people I served with. The hardest part is feeling like I have to hide that pride because people don't understand or believe it. Word spread quickly through the university about Sarah's revelation in the coffee shop. By the next morning, she could feel the subtle shift in how people looked at her as she walked across campus. Some stares held curiosity, others respect, and a few carried the kind of skepticism that made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. In her abnormal psychology class that Thursday, Professor Williams was discussing trauma responses when a student raised her hand. "Professor, we heard that there's actually a combat veteran in our class. Wouldn't it be interesting to get a first-hand perspective on PTSD?" Sarah felt 20 pairs of eyes turn toward her. Her heart rate spiked and she gripped her pen so tightly that her knuckles went white. Professor Williams, who had been unaware of Sarah's background, looked around the classroom with interest. "That would certainly provide valuable insight," the professor said carefully. "But we should remember that trauma is deeply personal, and no one should feel obligated to share their experiences." The student who had asked the question looked directly at Sarah. "I heard you're a ranger. Is that true? Like, did you actually see combat?" The challenge in the student's voice was unmistakable. Sarah recognized the tone from her previous encounters with skeptics who couldn't reconcile her appearance with their preconceptions about soldiers. She had hoped that her conversation in the coffee shop might put an end to the doubts, but instead it seemed to have amplified them. "I did serve," Sarah said quietly, not wanting to turn the class into a spectacle. "But were you actually in combat zones or were you in support roles?" pressed another student, David, who sat in the back row. "I mean, no offense, but you don't really look like someone who could handle that kind of thing." Professor Williams intervened before Sarah could respond. "Mr. Patterson, that's inappropriate. We don't judge anyone's capabilities based on their appearance," but David wasn't finished. "I'm just saying, there's a big difference between being deployed and actually being in combat. My cousin was deployed to Afghanistan too, but he spent most of his time on a secure base. Maybe that's what happened here." Sarah felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same anger that had prompted her to speak up in the coffee shop. But this time the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just casual conversation between students. This was her academic space, her attempt at building a new life, being invaded by doubt and disbelief. "You want to know about combat?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the classroom chatter. "You want to know what it's really like?" The room fell silent. Professor Williams looked concerned, clearly sensing that the situation was escalating beyond her control. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had spent 3 years hiding her scars, wearing long sleeves and high necklines to avoid questions and stares. But now, faced with direct challenges to her credibility, she felt something inside her shift. "You think you can tell by looking at someone whether they've been in combat?" Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "You think there's a certain way a soldier is supposed to look?" She began rolling up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing a jagged scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. The classroom was so quiet that the sound of fabric rustling seemed amplified. "This is from shrapnel from an IED explosion outside Kandahar," she said, her voice clinical and detached. 3 members of my unit were killed. I spent 2 weeks in a field hospital before they could evacuate me to Germany." Gasps echoed around the room. David's face had gone pale and even Professor Williams looked shocked. But Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled down the collar of her shirt slightly, revealing the top of another scar on her shoulder. "Bullet graze from a sniper during our 5th mission in the Kunar province. We were pinned down for 6 hours before air support could reach us." The room remained frozen in stunned silence. Sarah could see some students looking away, uncomfortable with the stark reality of her injuries. Others stared with a mixture of horror and fascination. "And this," Sarah said, pushing up the hem of her jeans to reveal a network of smaller scars on her shin, "is from crawling through broken concrete to reach a wounded teammate. I carried him 300 meters to the extraction point while taking enemy fire." She straightened her clothes and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every student who had questioned her service. "You wanted to know about combat? About what it looks like? Well, this is what it looks like. It looks like scars you hide under long sleeves. It looks like nightmares that wake you up 3 years later. It looks like sitting in a psychology class studying your own trauma, because you're trying to understand why you can't just get over it, like everyone expects you to." David had slumped in his chair, looking like he wanted to disappear. The student who had first brought up the topic was staring at her hands, clearly regretting her question. Professor Williams cleared her throat carefully. "Sarah, thank you for sharing that with us. I think we all have a better understanding now of how trauma can affect individuals differently." But Sarah wasn't ready to let the moment pass. 3 years of silence, of hiding, of allowing people to dismiss or doubt her experiences had built up into this moment of raw honesty. "The thing that bothers me most," she continued, isn't the physical scars. It's the assumption that I'm somehow less credible because I don't fit your image of what a soldier should look like. It's the idea that women in combat are just there for show, or that we're somehow weaker or less capable than our male counterparts. She looked directly at David. Your cousin may have been on a secure base, and that's fine. Every role in the military is important. But don't use his experience to diminish mine or anyone else's. And don't assume that someone's combat experience is invalid just because they don't match your stereotypes. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved. Students sat frozen in their seats, processing what they had witnessed. Professor Williams approached Sarah's desk cautiously. Sarah, if you need to talk about this, my office hours are... I'm fine, Sarah interrupted, gathering her books. Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm tired of hiding. As students began to file out of the classroom, several approached Sarah's desk. Some offered apologies, others thanked her for her service, and a few simply nodded with newfound respect. David was among the last to leave, stopping at her desk with obvious discomfort. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I was way out of line. I had no right to question your service. Sarah looked up at him, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. Just remember this feeling the next time you meet a veteran. Remember that you can't tell someone's story by looking at them. After the classroom had emptied, Sarah sat alone for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. She felt exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely empowered. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, she had refused to hide her truth. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake, the student from the coffee shop. Heard what happened in your psych class. You're incredible. Thank you for not letting them dismiss your service. Sarah smiled, realizing that her decision to speak up was creating ripples beyond what she had anticipated. Maybe it was time to stop hiding her scars and start using her voice to challenge the misconceptions that had silenced her for so long. The video appeared online 3 days later. Someone in Sarah's psychology class had recorded her revelation with their phone, capturing the moment she revealed her scars and confronted the skeptical students. Within hours, the clip had been shared across social media platforms with captions like "Female, Veteran Silences Doubters, and This Is What a Real Hero Looks Like." Sarah discovered the video when her phone started buzzing nonstop with notifications. Her stomach dropped as she watched herself on the small screen, reliving the moment she had chosen to expose her most guarded secrets. The comments section was a battlefield of opinions, ranging from overwhelming support to vicious attacks on her credibility and character. Fake scars, probably makeup, wrote one user. Real Rangers don't need to prove themselves to college kids, posted another. But for every negative comment, there were dozens of supportive messages from veterans, military families, and people expressing newfound understanding about the reality of women in combat. By Friday morning, the video had over 2 million views. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from news stations, documentary filmmakers, and podcast hosts wanting to interview her. She ignored most of them, but the attention made her feel like she was under siege again, this time by cameras and microphones instead of enemy fire. Her therapist, Dr. Patricia Reeves at the VA hospital, called an emergency session when she heard about the viral video. Sarah sat in the familiar beige office, staring at the motivational posters that had become as familiar as furniture over the past 3 years. How are you processing all of this attention? Dr. Reeves asked, her voice gentle but concerned. I feel like I opened Pandora's box, Sarah admitted. I thought I was just standing up to some ignorant college kids, and now the whole world is watching. Do you regret speaking up? Sarah considered the question carefully. No, I don't regret it, but I'm scared of what comes next. Some of these comments online are brutal. People are saying I'm lying about my service, that the scars are fake, that I'm just seeking attention. Dr. Reeves leaned forward. How does that make you feel? Angry, hurt, but also determined. Sarah paused, surprised by her own admission. For 3 years, I've been hiding who I am because I was afraid of exactly this kind of reaction. But now that it's happening, I realize that their opinions don't change what I've been through or what I've accomplished. The therapist smiled. That sounds like progress. The weird thing is, Sarah continued, I'm getting messages from other female veterans who saw the video, women who have been hiding their service too, afraid to speak up because they've faced similar doubts and dismissals. One woman told me she's been lying about her deployment for 5 years because she got tired of people questioning her story. Dr. Reeves nodded knowingly. Unfortunately, that's more common than it should be. Many female veterans struggle with having their service validated by society. Sarah's phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was a message from Maria Santos, her former teammate and medic who had saved countless lives before losing her leg to an IED explosion. The message was simple. Saw the video. So proud of you for finally speaking up. Time to stop hiding in the shadows. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from an unexpected source. Colonel Jennifer Hayes, her former commanding officer, had somehow gotten her number. Martinez. The familiar authoritative voice said when Sarah answered, "I saw your video." Sarah's heart rate spiked, instantly transported back to the military mindset where a call from her CO could mean anything from commendation to court-martial. "Ma'am, I hope I haven't embarrassed the unit." Colonel Hayes laughed, a sound Sarah had rarely heard during their deployment. "Embarrassed? Soldier, you've done more to educate the public about women in combat in 3 minutes than most recruitment campaigns do in a year. I'm calling to ask if you'd be interested in speaking at some military events. We need more voices like yours." The conversation lasted 20 minutes, with Colonel Hayes explaining that the military was actively seeking female veterans willing to share their stories to help with recruitment and public awareness campaigns. She mentioned speaking opportunities at military academies, veterans organizations, and congressional hearings about women's roles in combat. "I'll think about it," Sarah said, though the idea both excited and terrified her. That weekend, Sarah attended a local veterans support group meeting for the first time in months. She had stopped going regularly because she felt disconnected from the older male veterans who dominated the group, their experiences from Vietnam and Iraq seeming so different from her own. But tonight the room looked different. 3 other women sat in the circle, including Linda Parker, a Navy veteran Sarah had never seen before. The group facilitator, Tom Morrison, a Vietnam veteran with kind eyes and gray hair, welcomed everyone warmly. "Sarah," Tom said, "we saw your video. Would you like to share anything with the group?" For a moment, Sarah felt the familiar urge to deflect, to minimize her experience. But looking around the circle, she saw faces filled with understanding rather than skepticism. "I've been hiding for 3 years," she began, "not just from the public but from myself. I thought that if I didn't talk about my service, if I didn't wear it on my sleeve, then maybe I could just blend in and be normal." Linda Parker nodded knowingly. "I did the same thing for almost a decade. It's exhausting, constantly monitoring what you say, making sure you don't accidentally reveal too much." "The thing that surprised me most about the video going viral," Sarah continued, "is how many people reached out to say they had no idea women were in combat roles at all. Not just ignorant people, but educated people who simply had never been exposed to our stories." An older veteran named Frank, who had initially been skeptical of women in combat when Sarah first joined the group years earlier, cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Sarah. I saw your video and I realized I was just as guilty of making assumptions. Your generation of warriors faced things we never had to deal with, and you deserve better support than we've given you." The group spent the next 2 hours discussing the unique challenges faced by female veterans, from skepticism about their service to difficulty accessing appropriate care at VA facilities designed primarily for men. For the first time since her deployment, Sarah felt truly understood by her fellow veterans. As the meeting ended, Linda approached Sarah with a proposal. "There's a group of us female veterans who have been talking about starting a support network, specifically for women who served in combat roles. Would you be interested in helping us organize it?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who finally saw her for who she truly was, not who they expected her to be. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "It's time to stop hiding." Walking to her car after the meeting, Sarah felt a shift in her perspective. The viral video had been terrifying and overwhelming, but it had also opened doors she never knew existed. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, she felt like she had a purpose beyond just surviving. 6 months after the viral video changed her life, Sarah stood at a podium in the Pentagon briefing room, looking out at an audience of military leaders, congressional representatives, and policymakers. She wore her dress uniform for the first time since her discharge ceremony, the ribbons and medals on her chest telling the story she had hidden for so long. The invitation to speak at the Department of Defense Symposium on Women in Combat had come through Colonel Hayes, who now served as Sarah's mentor and advocate. The topic was breaking barriers and building bridges. the reality of female combat veterans' experiences. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and confident, I was hiding in plain sight. I was a psychology student who never mentioned my military service, a veteran who pretended her scars were from accidents, a woman who had learned that society was more comfortable with her silence than her truth. In the audience, she spotted Jake and Emma from the coffee shop, who had driven down from the university to hear her speak. Dr. Reeves sat in the third row, beaming with pride. Maria Santos was there too, her prosthetic leg a testament to her own sacrifices and strength. Sarah continued, I learned that day in a coffee shop that ignorance isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's just the absence of exposure to different perspectives. When I finally found the courage to share my story, I discovered that many people weren't trying to dismiss women's contributions to combat operations. They simply had never been educated about what we actually do. The presentation included statistics about female combat veterans, testimonials from women who had served in various roles, and recommendations for policy changes to better support their transition to civilian life. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah invited 3 other female veterans to join her on stage. Linda Parker, the Navy veteran from the support group, spoke about the challenges of accessing appropriate medical care. Captain Rodriguez, who had served 3 tours as a helicopter pilot, discussed the difficulties of finding employment that recognized her military skills. And Maria Santos, Sarah's former teammate, shared her experience of losing her leg while saving wounded soldiers under fire. We're not asking for special treatment, Sarah concluded. We're asking for recognition that our service is valid, our experiences are real, and our contributions to national security are significant. We're asking for the same respect and support given to all veterans who answered their country's call. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. Afterward, Congressional Representative Jennifer Adams approached Sarah with a proposal to testify before the House Veterans Affairs Committee about improving services for female veterans. Later that evening, at a reception hosted by the Military Women's Museum, Sarah found herself surrounded by active duty servicewomen, veterans from multiple conflicts, and advocates who had been fighting for recognition long before she found her voice. General Patricia Morrison, one of the highest-ranking women in the military, pulled Sarah aside. Your story has already changed things, she said. Recruitment of women for combat roles has increased 20% since your video went viral. More importantly, we're seeing increased reporting of harassment and discrimination because women feel more empowered to speak up. The conversation was interrupted by a young woman in dress blues who approached nervously. Excuse me, Ms. Martinez. I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chen. I wanted to thank you. I'm deploying to Syria next month, and your video helped me realize that I don't have to choose between being a soldier and being proud of who I am. Sarah shook the young lieutenant's hand, seeing herself 3 years earlier in the woman's determined eyes. Remember that your service matters regardless of what anyone else thinks, and don't wait 3 years to tell your story like I did. The next morning, Sarah appeared on a national news program to discuss the symposium and the ongoing challenges faced by female veterans. The interview was broadcast live, and she felt remarkably calm as she fielded questions from the host and viewers calling in. One caller, a Gold Star mother whose daughter had been killed in action in Iraq, thanked Sarah for honoring her daughter's memory by ensuring that women's combat service would be recognized and remembered. Another caller was Jake from the coffee shop. Sarah, this is Jake from the university. I wanted to call and say that you've completely changed how I think about military service. I'm actually considering joining the Army after graduation, and it's partly because of your example. When Sarah returned to campus the following week, she noticed immediate changes. The Veterans Resource Center had established a specific program for female veterans. Her psychology professors were incorporating more diverse perspectives on trauma and military service into their curricula. And most importantly, other student veterans were beginning to share their own stories. Sarah had also started a blog called Scars and Stories, where veterans could anonymously share their experiences. The response was overwhelming, with submissions from men and women who had served in conflicts spanning 5 decades. One submission particularly moved her. It was from a Vietnam veteran who had never talked about his experiences until reading Sarah's story. For 50 years, I thought strength meant silence. Your courage to speak up taught me that real strength means helping others understand what we've been through. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Sarah returned to the coffee shop where it all began. The space looked exactly the same, but she felt like a completely different person. She ordered her usual black coffee and sat at the same corner table where she used to hide. A group of students at a nearby table were discussing a documentary about female pilots in World War II. One of them mentioned Sarah's viral video, calling her that badass ranger who shut down those ignorant guys. Sarah smiled to herself, remembering how terrified she had been of judgment and disbelief. Now, she realized that the opinions of strangers mattered far less than the truth of her own experience and the impact she could have by sharing it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Saw your interview this morning. The documentary crew wants to include you in their film about women in special operations. You ready to reach an even bigger audience?" Sarah typed back quickly, ready to change more minds. "Let's do it." As she packed up her laptop and prepared to head to her advanced trauma psychology class, where she was now a teaching assistant, helping other students understand the complexities of military-related PTSD, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scars on her body would always tell the story of her service, but now they represented strength rather than shame. Her voice, once silenced by fear and misunderstanding, had become a tool for education and change. And her truth, no longer hidden behind long sleeves and careful deflections, was helping other veterans find the courage to share their own stories. Walking across campus toward her next class, Sarah passed a recruitment table where a young woman was asking detailed questions about opportunities for women in combat roles. The recruiter, a female sergeant, was answering confidently and thoroughly. Sarah paused for a moment, watching the interaction with satisfaction. This was the change she had hoped for. A world where women's military service was valued, respected, and accurately represented. Where young women considering military careers could see themselves reflected in the stories being told. Her scars had finally spoken their truth, and the world was listening.